In the last 2 decades, the Arctic has undergone a radical geopolitical transformation. The region that was once seen as the frozen periphery of the world has now become a new strategic space in international politics. This change is inseparable from the melting of sea ice due to global warming, which opens up new shipping routes, access to resources, and the possibility of a more intense military presence. Rob Hubert observes that the northern region, once seen as relatively safe from geopolitical competition, has faded, and tensions since 2014 show how the Arctic is turning into an arena for strategic competition between major powers. Russia, for example, has been aggressively rebuilding its military infrastructure in the Arctic region since the early 2010s. Marianne Laurel outlines how Moscow sees the Arctic as a vital region for national security, economic lifelines, and global power projection. Russia's air bases, military ports, and air defense systems in the Arctic directly impact the United States' strategic calculations, and once again position Greenland as a crucial balancing point. Meanwhile, China has also emerged with a different approach. Although not an Arctic nation, Beijing declared itself a near-Arctic nation in its 2018 White Paper on Arctic Policy. Oren R. Young explains in his book that China's Arctic strategy focuses on scientific research, infrastructure investment, and economic diplomacy. This includes interest in mining projects and ports in Greenland. For the United States, China's presence, even in the form of civilian investment, is seen as a potential security gap. This view is reflected in various policy reports. In its 2019 Department of Defense Arctic Strategy Report, the U.S. Department of Defense explicitly identified the Arctic as a region of long-term strategic competition with Russia and China. Greenland is said to be an important part of America's forward presence in the region. Thus, America's interests in Greenland do not stand alone. It is part of a broader Arctic geopolitical architecture, where issues of security, military power, shipping lanes, and global influence are intertwined. Greenland is a nexus where these various interests meet, and it is precisely for this reason that its political and legal status is so sensitive. And it is at this point that we begin to see that what the United States is fighting over in Greenland is not just a piece of land, but strategic possession in a shifting global order. However, beyond military and geopolitical considerations, there is another dimension that makes Greenland increasingly important in the United States calculations, and that is the global supply chain of strategic resources. In a fragile post-globalization world, a nation's strength is measured not only by its military fleet, but also by its ability to secure key raw materials for industry, technology, and defense, and Greenland holds great potential. Martin Broom explains that Greenland's mainland contains significant reserves of strategic minerals such as rare earth elements, or Re, uranium, zinc, and iron. And these minerals are not just ordinary economic commodities, but the foundation of modern technology, from electric vehicle batteries and wind turbines to advanced weapon systems. This potential is what makes Greenland's resource issues inseparable from the existing global dependency structure, particularly in the strategic mineral supply chain. The United States' dependence on rare earth imports from China is one of the main reasons for Washington's concern about Greenland. Julie Michelle Klinger asserts that China's dominance in REE processing has created strategic vulnerabilities for Western countries. In this context, Greenland is seen as a potential alternative for supply diversification. This issue is not speculative. America's interest in mining projects in Greenland has been reflected in various policy documents. In the Critical Mineral Strategy Report published by the U.S. Department of Energy, it is written that the Arctic region, including Greenland, is considered an important area for securing the supply of critical minerals in the future, and these interests are long-term and directly linked to the energy transition, green industrialization, and national resilience agendas. It is important to note, however, that Greenland's resource potential does not automatically mean unhindered exploitation. The Greenland government itself, through various self-government policies, actively regulates the mining sector by considering environmental, social, and political impacts. This places American interests in a more complex position, not as owners, but as actors who must negotiate within local legal and political frameworks. This is where American economic interests begin to directly intersect with the boundaries of sovereignty and international law. From the previous discussion, it is clear that the United States' interests in Greenland operate on three main levels: strategic access, geopolitical influence, and international legal restrictions. The three of them attract each other, and not always in line. Rebecca Pincus, in her testimony before the U.S. Senate Committee on the Geostrategic Importance of Greenland, emphasized that American interests in the Arctic region must be understood within the broader framework of global competition, encompassing security, resources, and strategic influence, not simply territorial acquisition. This framework of understanding demands a different perspective on how power is exercised in contemporary global politics. In the modern international system, power is no longer always exercised through territorial possession, but rather through a network of treaties, limited military presence, economic investment, and security diplomacy. But the legal limit remains a line that cannot be crossed. As explained previously, Greenland is under the sovereignty of the Kingdom of Denmark, with the inherent right of self-determination of the Greenlandic people. International law, particularly the principle of non-acquisition of territory through political pressure, makes the idea of purchasing Greenland not only unrealistic, but also contrary to post-World War II global norms. Ole Waver emphasized that the Arctic region is a test of the ability of major powers to exercise restraint within the framework of international law. The United States, as a country that claims to be the guardian of the international liberal order, is in a paradoxical position. He has a major interest in Greenland, but is limited by the norms he helped establish himself. It is at this point that we can understand why the European Union's response, particularly Denmark's, to the Greenland acquisition discourse has been so harsh. It is not just about political emotions, but also about protecting the precedent, law, and international politics. If Greenland is negotiable, then the principles of territorial sovereignty and the right to self-determination become fragile. Thus, America's interest in Greenland was never really about ownership. It is about securing access without overstepping boundaries, expanding influence without breaking the law, and maintaining a strategic position amidst the rapidly changing geopolitics of the Arctic. It is in this tension that Greenland has transformed from a remote island into one of the most sensitive nodes in contemporary global politics. The return of the narrative about the possibility of the United States wanting to take over Greenland as early as 2026 clearly immediately triggered a swift and decisive response from the Danish government. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen told international media that the United States has no right to annex other territories, including Greenland, which is part of the Kingdom of Denmark. Mette Frederiksen, in her various press statements, also said that talk about America needing Greenland was completely nonsense, and emphasized that other countries cannot simply annex territory that is part of Denmark's sovereignty. In this context, Denmark's refusal is clearly not only rhetorical, but also political. Copenhagen called on Washington to stop threatening allies and stressed that transatlantic relations should be built on cooperation, not intimidation. Such statements are also accompanied by increased Danish investment in the Arctic region, both in defense forces and civil infrastructure, as a form of long-term strategy to maintain Greenland's sovereignty within the framework of the alliance. Public demonstrations in the Danish capital also reflect how deeply this rejection is felt by civilians. Thousands of people took to the streets of Copenhagen, gathered in the city center, and marched toward the U.S. Embassy chanting slogans such as "Greenland is not for sale," signaling that the defense of Greenland's sovereignty is seen as a crucial democratic issue and political principle in Denmark. The Greenland government itself, which has autonomous status but is still under the umbrella of the Danish kingdom, firmly rejects the idea of acquisition or annexation by the United States. In an official statement reported by Reuters and other international media, the Greenland government stated that the territory would not be accepted under any circumstances for external parties to take over. Greenland's Prime Minister, J.Z. Frederik Nielsen, even stated that if forced to choose, Greenland would choose Denmark, NATO, and the European Union as its main partners, not the United States. In a statement quoted by Time, Jens Frederik Nielsen emphasized that the Greenlandic people do not want to be part of America, even in the context of national security strategy. This statement not only expressed Greenland's internal political stance, but also immediately resonated regionally, triggering a collective response from European actors who saw the issue as transcending mere bilateral relations. For many European countries, both members and non-members of the Eurozone, the rejection of the idea of annexation or territorial transactions is a symbol of commitment to sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the rule of international law. In his interview with Euronews News, European Council President Antonio Costa emphasized that the European Union will provide full support to Denmark in maintaining its sovereignty over Greenland on the grounds that Denmark, as a sovereign state, determines its own policies within the framework of its membership in the bloc. In his interview, he emphasized that Denmark is a sovereign country and the European Union will support it. While stating that maintaining the principle of territorial integrity is a fundamental issue that cannot be negotiated, the European Community of Nations also expressed their stance in unison. Several reports have reported that heads of European governments, from France and Germany to the United Kingdom, have stated that any attempt to overturn the political decisions agreed between Denmark and Greenland must be made through local people and institutions, not through external pressure or threats. It is hoped that such a joint statement will strengthen the European bloc's collective solidarity towards multilateral values. Moreover, recent developments indicate that several European countries have coordinated diplomatic steps through broader NATO mechanisms. This shows that this solidarity is not just rhetoric, but is also expressed in the form of real actions, such as the placement of a small European government unit in Greenland as a symbol of support for the territory's sovereignty. However, when these political and security signals failed to reduce tensions, the dynamics of the Greenland conflict began to move beyond the realm of diplomacy and defense and into economic instruments. This escalation was evident when Donald Trump openly linked the Greenland issue to his trade policy towards Europe. Reuters reported in early 2026 that the United States, through its president, was considering imposing tariffs on a number of European countries, including Denmark, as part of what he called a strategic adjustment in relations related to America's security interests in Greenland. Trump argued that America had long protected Europe militarily, and that Europe should be more cooperative on issues deemed vital to U.S. national interests. The statement immediately sparked a strong reaction from Brussels. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, in an official statement quoted by Reuters, warned that linking territorial sovereignty to trade tariffs could create a downward spiral in transatlantic relations and undermine the foundations of economic cooperation that have been built over decades. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez even openly stated that if the United States really imposes its will on Greenland, it would be the biggest gift for Vladimir Putin because it would undermine NATO's trust and internal cohesion from within. Pedro Sánchez believes that such aggression will weaken the West's moral position in opposing Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because standards of sovereignty will no longer be consistent. The Financial Times also noted that the threat of these tariffs immediately caused anxiety in European markets, particularly in the Nordic countries, which are heavily dependent on exports to the United States. Denmark is seen as one of the most vulnerable parties, given its open economic structure and dependence on transatlantic trade. Among European diplomats, this move was perceived as a fundamental shift in America's approach to allies.
Politico Europe quoted a senior EU official as calling the threat a dangerous move by the president, as it was the first time the issue of an ally's territorial integrity had been directly linked to economic penalties. In its analysis, the Atlantic Council even stated that the Greenland crisis has the potential to be NATO's darkest moment, opening old wounds about the balance of power within the alliance and raising fundamental questions. Is NATO still a united alliance, or has it become an instrument of one country's interests? Amid these internal tensions within NATO, Russia has taken a rhetorically critical position, but strategically, Moscow sees the Greenland crisis not just as a conflict between America and Europe, but as an opportunity to highlight what it calls Western hypocrisy on the issue of sovereignty and international law. Russian media and officials openly mocked the situation.
The Moscow Times reports how Russia's official narrative portrays the United States as a power that demands respect for Ukraine's territorial integrity, but at the same time threatens the sovereignty of its own allies' territory. In the report, Russian media highlighted that if the West condones such actions, then their moral arguments against Russia will lose legitimacy. The Russian government also stressed that these tensions show the fragility of Western unity. In a report cited by Russian sources, Moscow assessed that Denmark and Greenland's firm stance in rejecting American pressure actually shows that Europe is increasingly aware of the risks of unilateral domination within the Western alliance. But behind the verbal criticism, Russia continues to monitor the situation very seriously. The Arctic is a strategic region for Moscow, both from a military and economic perspective, and as a symbol of global power. Over the past decade, Russia has reactivated Soviet-era military bases, built port infrastructure, and strengthened its nuclear icebreaker fleet in the Arctic region. The Greenland tensions give Russia a chance to observe how NATO reacts to internal conflicts and gauge the alliance's ability to maintain coordination in the north. Reuters reports that Danish military officials confirmed no Russian or Chinese warships were detected around Greenland during the tensions. This statement implicitly indicates that Russia is choosing a wait-and-see approach rather than direct confrontation. Thus, Russia's position in the Greenland crisis is not a passive one. Moscow is exploiting the situation to strengthen a counter-narrative, observing gaps in NATO solidarity, and positioning itself as an actor that, at least rhetorically, claims to defend the principles of sovereignty and non-interference, while maintaining its strategic interests in the Arctic. In contrast to Russia, which has chosen a position of observing while criticizing, China has taken a more cautious approach. However, the message requirements are normative. Beijing has consistently placed the Greenland issue within the framework of international law and multilateralism, an attitude that strategically benefits its position as a global power that wants to be perceived as stable and rational. In a press conference at the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, quoted by Reuters, it was emphasized that the status of Greenland is an internal affair of the Kingdom of Denmark and the Greenlandic people themselves, and must be resolved based on the principles of the UN Charter, especially sovereignty and the right to self-determination. In this case, we can see how China explicitly rejects any form of unilateral claims or political pressure that could disrupt the stability of the Arctic region. And this statement is significant because it comes from a country that has become increasingly active in the Arctic in the last decade. In 2018, Beijing described itself as the Near Arctic and was actively involved in scientific research, shipping, and resource investment in the region. But in the case of Greenland, Beijing chose to refrain from overt maneuvers. The South China Morning Post newspaper pointed out that China's stance is not merely one of legal idealism, but rather a strategic calculation. By rejecting America's coercive approach, Beijing is seeking to position itself as a supporter of the rules-based international order while avoiding direct escalation with NATO in the Arctic region. In a broader context, this stance reflects China's long-term strategy of exploiting internal tensions in the West to reinforce the narrative that the world needs shared rules, not the dominance of one power. It is from this point that Greenland is ultimately no longer just an object of dispute or a piece in the geopolitical game of great powers. It has become a reflection of a changing world, A world where the lines between security and coercion, between cooperation and domination, are increasingly blurred. What is at stake in Greenland is not just the Arctic region, but the future direction of the international order itself. Will the world move towards the normalization of the politics of pressure, or will it maintain the principle that territory and people cannot be treated as strategic commodities? Amidst the melting of the polar ice caps, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. It is precisely in the most remote and isolated regions that the most fundamental struggles for power, law, and global legitimacy are taking place. And Greenland stands there, not as a spectator, but part of the battle of the ages.